The desperate call. The war room of the Galactic Coalition buzzed with desperate energy as holographic displays showed the same terrifying truth that had haunted their dreams for 5 long years. Red zones spread across the star map like a plague, marking systems that no longer existed. Not destroyed, not conquered, but simply gone, consumed by something that defied every law of physics the galaxy's greatest minds understood. Supreme Chancellor Vextar stood before the massive display, his ethereal form flickering with the stress that had aged him centuries in mere years. Around the crystalline table sat representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, each bearing the weight of their species' survival on their shoulders. The air itself seemed heavy with the knowledge that they were losing a war they barely understood how to fight. The Etherians had ruled through wisdom and technology for millennia, their energy-based forms allowing them to manipulate matter at the quantum level. The Christek Empire commanded fleets of ships that could reshape reality itself, their living crystal technology growing and adapting in real time. The Biosyndicate wielded the power of evolution itself, creating weapons and defenses from modified life forms that could adapt to any threat within hours. Yet none of it mattered against the void. The entities that emerged from the spaces between space consumed everything they touched, leaving behind regions where reality itself seemed thin and wrong. They appeared without warning, great writhing masses of darkness that moved through dimensions like swimming through water. Traditional weapons passed through them harmlessly, energy attacks were absorbed and redirected, and even the most advanced shields provided only moments of protection before the void found ways around them. Commander Thax of the Christek Empire slammed his crystalline fist against the table, sending harmonic vibrations through the chamber. "We have thrown everything we have at these creatures," he growled through his translucent features. "Our greatest battle fleets, our most advanced weapons, our finest tactical minds. Nothing works. They adapt to every strategy, counter every weapon, and still they advance." The Biosyndicate representative, a creature that shifted between multiple evolutionary forms as it spoke, added its voice to the despair. "Our adaptation algorithms cannot keep pace with their changes. We create a countermeasure, and within hours they have developed 3 new approaches that render it useless. They learn faster than we can evolve." Vextar nodded grimly, his form brightening with determination despite the hopelessness of their situation. "Which is why we must take the step that pride has prevented us from taking until now. We must call for help from every corner of known space. Every species, no matter how primitive, no matter how unlikely. The universe is vast, and perhaps somewhere among the countless worlds there exists a solution we have not considered." The chamber fell silent as the weight of this decision settled over them. To broadcast their failure, their desperation, to species they had long considered beneath their notice was a humiliation that cut deep, but pride was a luxury they could no longer afford when extinction was the alternative. Within hours, the message went out across all known communication channels, translated into thousands of languages, and transmitted on frequencies that could reach the farthest corners of explored space. It was a simple message, stripped of the usual diplomatic formalities. "The galaxy is dying. We have failed to stop the threat. Any who can help, please respond." Coordinates attached. The responses came quickly from species they expected. Warrior races offered their fleets. Technological civilizations promised their most advanced weapons. Ancient beings shared cryptic advice that might or might not be useful. But buried among the expected replies was one that caused confusion and quiet laughter among the coalition leadership. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Space Navy." The message began in clear, unadorned language. "We have received your distress call and analyzed the available data on the void entities. Earth hereby volunteers its full military and scientific resources to assist in resolving this crisis. Our fleet will depart immediately for the provided coordinates." The reaction in the war room was immediate and dismissive. Earth was barely a footnote in galactic civilization, a small blue world on the outer rim whose inhabitants had only achieved interstellar travel within the last century. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards, their military tiny compared to the great fleets of the major powers, and their understanding of advanced physics was rudimentary at best. Humans, Thax said with something approaching amusement. I remember when they first made contact. Crude chemical rockets and basic fusion technology. What could they possibly offer that we have not already tried and failed with? But Vextar studied the message more carefully, noting details that others had dismissed. Their response time was remarkably quick for a species so far from the core worlds. And look at this data analysis they mention. They claim to have studied our reports and reached conclusions. What conclusions could they possibly reach that we have not? The question was answered 3 days later when the human fleet arrived at the staging area near the Nexus system, the Coalition's last major stronghold before the expanding void zones. The ships that dropped out of hyperspace caused another round of dismissive laughter from the assembled alien commanders. Where the Coalition vessels were works of art as much as war machines, flowing curves of crystalline perfection, or biomechanical growths that pulsed with life, the human ships looked utilitarian to the point of ugliness. They were angular metal boxes covered in sensor arrays and communication equipment, their hulls scarred and patched from obvious modifications made during the journey. No flowing lines, no artistic flourishes, no demonstration of technological superiority. They looked like the kind of ships a primitive species might cobble together from spare parts and desperate ingenuity. Admiral Chen's flagship requested permission to dock with the Coalition command station, and within an hour she stood before the assembled leaders in person. She was smaller than most of the alien representatives, wearing a simple military uniform that looked almost primitive compared to the advanced materials and energy patterns that clothed the others. Her hair was graying at the temples, her face lined with what appeared to be years of stress, and her eyes held an intensity that seemed out of place for someone from such a supposedly backward species. "Thank you for allowing us to participate," she said simply, her voice carrying none of the formal diplomatic language the others expected. "We've spent the 3 days of travel analyzing every scrap of data you've made available about the void entities, and we believe we have identified several critical oversights in your approach." The silence that followed was deafening. Thax's crystalline features actually began to glow with suppressed anger. "Oversights. You believe that civilizations with millions of years of scientific advancement have made oversights that a species that has barely left its home system can identify." Chen nodded calmly, seemingly unbothered by the hostility. "Yes. You've been treating this as a military problem when it's actually a communication problem. You've been trying to destroy entities that exist partially outside normal spacetime when you should be trying to understand what they want. And most critically, you've been assuming they're hostile when the evidence suggests they might be desperate." The Biosyndicate representative shifted through several forms rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. "Desperate. They have consumed 40% of known space. Entire civilizations have been devoured." "Have they?" Chen asked quietly. "Or have those regions been transformed into something you don't recognize? Your own reports mention that the consumed areas don't show typical signs of destruction. No debris fields, no energy signatures of violence, no distress signals that cut off mid-transmission. Matter and energy simply reorganize into patterns you can't understand." She gestured to the holographic display showing the void zones. "Look at the expansion pattern. It's not random predation. There's a logic to it, a purpose. They're not consuming space. They're reshaping it. The question is why." Dr. Marcus Reed, who had entered quietly during Chen's presentation, stepped forward carrying a tablet filled with calculations and theoretical models. He was a thin man with intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he moved with the focused energy of someone who had spent days without sleep working on a fascinating problem. "We've run simulations based on your data," he said, his voice carrying the excitement of a researcher who had made a breakthrough. "The void entities aren't from this dimension. The mathematical models suggest they're refugees from a collapsing reality, trying to create stable spaces where they can exist. They're not attacking your civilization. They're trying to create an environment where they can survive. The war room erupted in angry voices and dismissive sounds, but Vextar raised a hand for silence. His ethereal form flickered with intense thought as he considered the implications. Even if that were true, which seems impossible, it changes nothing. They are still destroying our worlds, our people. No, Chen said firmly. They're transforming them. And if we're right, if they're truly refugees trying to survive, then there might be a solution that doesn't require anyone to die. She activated her own holographic display, showing tactical plans that looked unlike anything the assembled aliens had ever seen. Where their strategies focused on weapons placement, fleet movements, and defensive positions, the human plans showed communication arrays, translation matrices, and what appeared to be diplomatic protocols for contact with interdimensional entities. "We propose a test," Chen continued. "Let us make contact with them. Let us try to communicate before we assume destruction is the only option. If we're wrong, you lose nothing but a small human fleet. If we're right, we might find a solution that saves everyone." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The humans weren't offering to fight the void. They were offering to talk to it. The idea was so alien to every military doctrine the coalition possessed that it seemed like madness. But it was also the first new approach anyone had suggested in 5 years of devastating losses. Fax finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with skepticism. "You would risk your entire species on a theory, on the possibility that creatures that have consumed half the galaxy might be reasonable." Admiral Chen met his gaze steadily, and for the first time the assembled aliens saw something in her eyes that gave them pause. It wasn't fear or desperation or even hope. It was the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted that she might not survive what came next, but was determined to try anyway. "Commander Thax," she said quietly, "my species has survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and our own worst impulses. We've learned that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones we refuse to try to understand. If these entities are truly hostile, then fighting them conventionally has already proven futile. But if they're just trying to survive, then maybe we can find a way for everyone to live." She paused, looking around the room at faces that showed mixtures of hope, fear, and disbelief. "The galaxy asked for heroes. We're not heroes. We're problem solvers. And every problem has a solution if you're willing to look for it in the right places." As the human admiral spoke, something cold settled in the stomachs of the assembled alien leaders. They had expected warriors or scientists or diplomats. Instead, they had received humans who approached their greatest existential threat like researchers examining an interesting specimen. The calm way Chen discussed potentially sacrificing her entire species for a theory was more unsettling than any battle cry or heroic speech could have been. They had asked the universe for salvation, and the universe had sent them problem solvers who didn't seem to understand that some problems couldn't be solved. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but felt by all, was whether humanity's terrifying optimism would save them all or doom them to an even worse fate. The terrifying solution. The Nexus system had once been the crown jewel of the Christek Empire, a binary star system with 7 worlds that had been shaped into perfect geometric forms over thousands of years. Now it stood as the last major stronghold before the void zones, its crystalline cities and orbital platforms serving as the staging ground for what everyone knew might be the final battle of the war. The combined fleet that gathered there was the largest military force in galactic history. Thousands of ships from dozens of species, weapons that could crack planets, shields that could withstand the fury of stars, and the finest military minds the galaxy had ever produced. It was a force that should have been capable of conquering entire galactic arms, yet every being present knew it might not be enough. Admiral Chen stood in the Coalition Command Center, studying tactical displays that showed the approaching void entities. They moved through space like living shadows, their forms shifting and changing in ways that hurt to observe directly. Long-range sensors detected massive readings, but the data made no sense. energy signatures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, mass readings that fluctuated between 0 and infinity, and movement patterns that suggested they were traveling through spaces that didn't exist. "Contact in 6 hours," reported Commander Thax, his crystalline form reflecting the harsh lights of the command center. Despite his earlier skepticism, he had thrown the full support of the Christek Empire behind the human plan, though Chen suspected it was more from desperation than conviction. "All fleets are in position. The communication arrays your people requested are active and ready." Reed looked up, his eyes bright with the fever of discovery. "It's beautiful, Sarah. Terrifying, but beautiful. They're not from a parallel dimension. They're from a dimension that's collapsing into ours. Their reality is failing, and they're desperately trying to create stable pockets where they can exist. Every attack has been an attempt to establish a foothold in our spacetime." He gestured to the display showing the void zones. "Look at the pattern. They're not random. Each zone is a carefully constructed bridge between their dying reality and ours. They're not invaders. They're refugees using the only method available to them to survive." Vextar's ethereal form flickered with intense thought. "Even if that's true, Doctor, they're still transforming our worlds, displacing our people. How do you propose we communicate with entities that exist partially outside our reality?" "Pain," Reed said simply, causing shocked silence throughout the command center. "Pain is universal. It transcends dimensional boundaries because it's fundamentally about the disruption of preferred states. They're in pain from their reality collapse, and we're in pain from their transformation of our space. Pain is the one language that translates across any barrier." Chen felt a chill as she understood what he was suggesting. "You want us to hurt them." "Controlled aggression," Reed corrected. "Precisely calibrated to communicate rather than destroy. We cause them discomfort in specific patterns, and if they're truly intelligent, they'll respond with similar patterns. It's negotiation through carefully applied violence." The alien commanders exchanged looks of horror and fascination. The human approach to diplomacy was unlike anything in their experience. Where other species would send messages of peace or offerings of cooperation, the humans proposed to establish communication through mutual infliction of pain. "This is madness," whispered the Biosyndicate representative. "You're talking about torture as a form of first contact." "No," Chen said firmly. "We're talking about finding a common language with entities whose existence is so different from ours that traditional communication is impossible. If they understand pain, and we understand pain, then we have a starting point for understanding each other." The hours passed with agonizing slowness as final preparations were made. Human engineers worked alongside alien technicians to modify weapon systems for precise, non-lethal strikes. Communication arrays were calibrated to detect and interpret responses across multiple dimensional frequencies. Most disturbing of all, volunteer human crews prepared themselves to serve as test subjects, ready to allow the void entities to inflict controlled pain on them to establish the communication protocol. When the entities finally arrived, their presence warped space itself around them. Reality seemed to bend and twist in their vicinity, creating optical illusions that made seasoned spacers nauseated. They moved with purpose toward the assembled fleet, and for a moment it seemed like the gathered forces would engage in traditional combat. Then Admiral Chen gave the order that changed everything. "All ships, implement protocol empathy. Begin controlled aggression sequence." The human ships opened fire, but their weapons had been carefully modified. Instead of the devastating destructive force they were designed for, they projected precisely calibrated energy patterns designed to cause discomfort without permanent damage. The beams struck the lid void entity, and for the first time in the war, there was a reaction that wasn't complete absorption or redirection. The entity recoiled, its form shifting and pulsing in what could only be described as surprise. Then, after a moment of apparent consideration, it responded in kind. Tendrils of dark energy reached out and touched the human flagship, not with the reality warping force that had destroyed so many other vessels, but with a gentle probe that caused the ship's crew to experience a brief moment of disorientation and unease. "It's working," Reed breathed, his hands flying over his instruments as he interpreted the readings. "They're responding to the pain stimulus with their own controlled application. They understand what we're trying to do." What followed was the strangest diplomatic negotiation in galactic history. The humans and the void entities exchanged carefully measured applications of discomfort, each side gradually building a vocabulary of sensation that allowed for increasingly complex communication. The assembled alien fleets watched in fascination and horror as humanity established first contact through an elaborate dance of mutual torment. Hours passed as patterns emerged from the exchange. The entities began to project images directly into the minds of the human crews, sharing memories of their dying reality and their desperate flight into this dimension. In return, human volunteers allowed the entities to experience their own memories of loss, adaptation, and survival. What emerged was a story that transformed the entire war from a conflict of destruction into a tragedy of misunderstanding. The void entities were indeed refugees, the last survivors of a reality that had collapsed due to fundamental changes in the physical laws that governed it. They had no choice but to flee into other dimensions, transforming spaces to create pockets where they could exist without dying. But the revelation that shook the assembled alien commanders to their core was what the entities showed them about humanity itself. Through their unique dimensional perspective, the void entities could see aspects of human consciousness that even humans themselves didn't fully understand. Humans, they revealed, were unique among galactic species in their ability to empathize with utterly alien forms of existence. Where other species saw enemies to be destroyed or problems to be solved through superior technology, humans saw beings to be understood. This wasn't because they were more peaceful or more advanced, but because their evolutionary history had forced them to constantly adapt to environments and circumstances that should have been impossible to survive. The terrifying truth that the entities shared was that humans didn't just empathize with other species, they empathized with forces of nature, with abstract concepts, even with their own destruction. They could find common ground with anything because they had learned to see themselves in everything, no matter how alien or hostile it appeared. As the communication deepened, a solution began to emerge. The void entities didn't need to transform entire systems to survive. With the right technology and cooperation, stable dimensional pockets could be created that would allow them to exist without displacing the galaxy's native species. But the process would require volunteers to serve as dimensional anchors, beings who could exist partially in both realities and maintain the stability of the bridging zones. The volunteers would live, but they would be forever changed, existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions and serving as permanent ambassadors between realities. It was a sacrifice that would last for centuries, possibly millennia, and there was no guarantee that those who underwent the transformation would remain recognizably human. Admiral Chen looked around the command center at her crew, all of whom had stepped forward without hesitation when the need for volunteers was explained. Dr. Reed was already running calculations on how many humans would be needed and what the transformation process would entail. There was no fear in their faces, no hesitation about a sacrifice that would fundamentally alter their existence. "We'll do it," Chen said simply, her voice carrying the same calm certainty that had unsettled the alien commanders from the beginning. "We'll serve as the anchors, as many as you need, for as long as you need." The silence that followed was deafening. Vextar's ethereal form flickered with emotions that had no names in most languages. Around the command center, representatives of the galaxy's greatest civilizations stared at the humans with a mixture of awe and terror. "You would sacrifice your humanity itself to save species that barely acknowledge your existence?" Thax asked, his crystalline voice carrying harmonics of disbelief. Chen looked at him with eyes that held depths the alien commander was only beginning to understand. "Commander, we stopped being purely human the moment we left Earth and encountered the galaxy. Every species we've met, every world we've seen, every impossible thing we've survived has changed us. This is just the next step in becoming what we need to be. She gestured to the displays showing the void entities, who had begun to pulse with patterns that Reed's instruments interpreted as gratitude and hope. Besides, solving impossible problems is what we do. The fact that this particular solution requires us to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously just makes it more interesting. As the transformation process began, with human volunteers entering specially constructed chambers that would gradually phase them between realities, the assembled alien commanders finally understood what made humanity so terrifying. It wasn't their technology, which was primitive, or their military might, which was insignificant compared to the great powers. It was their absolute refusal to accept that any problem was unsolvable, even if the solution required them to stop being entirely human. The war ended not with victory or defeat, but with an evolution that changed both sides forever. The void entities found stable homes in dimensional pockets maintained by human anchors, while humanity gained the ability to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. The galaxy was saved, but at a cost that only humans had been willing to pay. In the years that followed, the other species of the galaxy watched the dimensional anchors with a mixture of gratitude and unease. They were recognizably human in some ways, but their consciousness existed across multiple planes of reality, giving them perspectives and abilities that defied understanding. They served as translators between the void entities and normal space, facilitating a cooperation that gradually transformed galactic civilization itself. The galaxy had called for heroes and received problem solvers. But what they learned too late was that humans didn't solve problems by defeating them or overcoming them. They solved problems by becoming whatever was necessary to make the solution work, even if it meant becoming something that was no longer entirely human. The transformation was complete, the crisis resolved, and the galaxy safer than it had ever been. But late at night, in the quiet moments between dimensions, some of the alien leaders wondered if they had traded one existential threat for another. The humans had saved them all, but in doing so had revealed a capacity for adaptation and sacrifice that was more alien than anything the void had shown them. The universe had asked for hope, and terrifying humans had arrived. They had delivered exactly what was requested, but at a cost that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. Peace had been achieved, but it was a peace maintained by beings who existed simultaneously in multiple realities, who had willingly sacrificed their humanity to become something new and impossible and utterly necessary. The galaxy was safe. Whether it was still the same galaxy that had sent out that desperate plea for help was a question that would haunt philosophers and leaders for centuries to come.